Magandang gabi po mga katipon sa Pilipinas. Ito po ang ating katipunan. Muling sumasa inyong mga tagapakinig upang magbigay ng mahalagang impormasyon, magbigay liwanag, at higit sa lahat makinig sa inyong mga daing at kuro-kuro hinggil sa mga problemang patuloy na nagpapahirap sa ating kalagayan at kabuhayan. Sa susunod na oras, iskapin po namin ipaliwanag ang iba-ibang bahagi ng ating ekonomiya at ang mga mabibigat pang local and international issues na may malaking epekto sa ating buhay at kinabukasan. Ito po ang inyong katipon na si Butch Valdes. Kasama ang ating magiting na guwapo pero hindi kasing guwapo ng tatay na anak ko, si Itos Valdes. Is on the nandiyan pa sa controls, no? At ang mga manunood po sa atin at kasamahan din po natin dito sa Save the Nation Movement at sa mga membro po ng Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino, isa pong national political party. Kami po dito ay nag-aanyaya sa inyo na makibahagi sa ating talakayan sa pagsusuri ng mga kasalukuyang problema at paghahanap ng kaukulang solusyon. Okay, ngayon pong gabi, lilis po lamang tayo ng sandali sa mga current issues na nakabagabag dito po sa ating bansang Pilipinas. Na we have talked about the ABS-CBN quite at length, and you see a lot of it in the newspapers and on television as well, At tungkol po sa mga COVID, pare-pareho din po ang naririnig natin. Hindi pa po natin masyadong maramdaman ang tunay na sitwasyon hinggil dito sa COVID-19. Totoo ba itong mga statistikong nakikita natin? Bakit napakataas ng mga mortality rates naman ng mga ibang lugar at bakit yung mga ibang mababa? Meron bang reasons for this? At any rate, hindi po natin masasagot yung mga katanungan ngayon, but it's best to also to go into other subjects na naramdaman po namin dito sa mga nakaraan na programa ng ating katipunan. Marami pong interesado kung anong nangyayari sa ibang bansa, specifically dito po sa bansang Amerika. At tayo, palagay ko tayo lang ang programa, both in the mainstream media and here, that talk to nationals of the other countries, and discuss with them what is happening there and from their viewpoint, not from a Filipino viewpoint, but from a national, an American viewpoint as to what is happening dito po sa Estados Unidos. Bakit po Estados Unidos? Importante po ang Estados Unidos sa buong mundo. At dito din po sa atin, importante po ang Estados Unidos dahil halos lahat po tayo, meron tayong kamag-anak na nakatira o nagtatrabaho sa Estados Unidos o nag-aaral sa Estados Unidos. And whatever happens there has an impact on what we do here. Whatever happens there also affects our decisions here in the Philippines. Not just in governments, but even families, kung ano pong nangyayari. At importante po sa atin. Sabi nga nila, when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. This is to some extent true because they are indeed still the largest economy in the world. At right now, being the worst hit in as far as the COVID-19 is concerned. and decisions being made there are always political. Palagi pong meron mga bumabatikos sa kanilang presidente, maraming sumusuporta, at tuloy-tuloy ang palitan nitong mga ito hinggil sa mga desisyon at nangyayari. That's why nakatutok po tayo kung gusto po natin malaman kung anong nangyayari sa Estados Unidos. Malalaman din natin kung ano ang nangyayari sa ibang lugar ng ating mundo, at nakikita na po natin kung ano pong epekto sa politika dito, politika sa rehiyon, hinggil sa China, South Korea, Korea, Japan, and so on and so forth, no? Dito po sa ating Southeast Asian region as well. So tonight, minarapat ko pong imbitahin isang taong ay kakilala na namin. Ang pangalan niya po ay si Daniel Burke. He's a young man dahil po mas bata sa akin, no? Young man of about 40-something years old. He's of course with the Schiller Institute and the International LaRouche Movement, and he is a senatorial candidate. He's running as an independent senatorial candidate coming from the state of New Jersey. Yan po yung at tatanungin po natin sa kanya kung ano ang mga relevant types of information that I think would be interesting to many of our Filipinos. Lalong-lalo na po itong mga ating mga kababayan na may mga kamag-anak sa Amerika. I'm sure you would like to know more about what's happening, not just from the viewpoint of your relatives in the U.S., but from somebody else that can speak with authority as to what's happening in the United States. So, tabayanan po natin ang ating po kaibigan na si Daniel Burke. Meanwhile, it will take a little while apparently para matawagan natin, but ito pong si Daniel Burke is in his youth has always been with the LaRouche organization. He has been very outspoken, at ang tapang po nito dahil mismong lalong-lalo na nung kapanahunan ni Obama, no? Tumitindig po siya sa mga iba-ibang mga fora na at tatanungin niya yung kinakailangan tanungin, no? Kung minsan dahil hindi sinasagot, binabatikos niya right there, at isa siya dun sa mga militant youth, no? That are very critical of what Obama was doing in the Middle East and in the US and to the rest of the world, no? At sa akin pong palagay, personally, kung natuloy itong kapalit ni Obama, kung natuloy si Hillary Clinton, palagay ko by today we will be already in World War III, kasi ganyan po ang takbo ng pag-iisip nitong mga ito sa grupo nila Obama at nila Clinton. Buti na lang po at nanalo itong si Donald Trump, no? Pero hindi pa po natin sigurado kung anong mangyayari. Pero as of now, maganda po ang ating nababalitaan, kasi si Donald Trump, si Xi Jinping, si Vladimir Putin ng Russia, at si President Modi ng India are in constant communication with each other. Yan po ay magandang development, at maski na nagkakaroon ng kung ano-anong mga posisyon at kung ano-anong sinasabi ng kanilang mga alipores sa gobyerno, no? Parang meron silang usapan, hanggang hindi nyo naririnig galing sa akin, no? huwag kayong maniniwala. Ganyan na rin siguro ang sinasabi ni Xi Jinping kay Trump at yan din ang sinasabi ni Putin sa kanilang lahat, no? Kasi maraming sa ilalim o sa mga lugar sa gobyerno nila na iba-iba ang pag-iisip, iba-iba ang kanilang intensyon, at marami po sa kanilang gusto nang mag-umpisa ng gera. Pero swerte po tayo, itong 4 na leaders na ito ay mukhang hindi. Wala po silang intensyon at wala po silang plano na dalhin ang mundo sa gera. Okay, I think we have Daniel Burke on the line now. We'll check it out. Daniel, are you there?
I'm here.
Oh, great. Okay, Daniel Burke. As you know, this is Butch Valdes, and Itos Valdes is on the controls. We appreciate your being able to accommodate our request so that we can interview you regarding the developments in the U.S. and probably the rest of the world. How are you, Daniel?
I'm very well, Butch. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yes. It must be very early there where you are, and thank you for waking up early.
I'm glad to be on. Well, it's just morning on Mother's Day, and we're making pancakes. And now I'm going to be joining you on this program. And we had a fantastic event yesterday on the 75th anniversary of the Victory in Europe Day, the defeat of fascism. So I'm really happy to be able to report some of this to you.
Great. Okay. Daniel, as you know, there are many Filipinos in the United States, and most everybody here in the Philippines has a relative there. And it will be good to be, I told prior to your coming on, I was briefing the audience that it is best that we get to hear somebody from the United States, more especially if that somebody is of a senatorial candidate. And it will be good for them to get to know you and probably also be able to get information, not just from their relatives, but from you, as to how things are in the U.S. and the rest of the world. I'll give you the floor, Daniel, and you can start with it.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's true. I am an independent candidate for U.S. Senate. I recently registered with my candidacy with the FEC in New Jersey. I've had, in fact, at the last event that I held in Edison before the pandemic, I had a good-sized Filipino contingent. So I'm really glad to be able to speak to your audience in that regard. But I mean, look, the situation in the world is completely untenable. There is a drastic need for leadership, and it's happening here. It's apparent here in the United States as it is everywhere else. New Jersey is the second richest state in the United States, and not that long ago we had major news stories about a food bank for people to receive food who are struggling with hunger, with a line that was a whole mile long.
Wow. Wow.
In addition,
a mile long in terms of a line for food, did you say?
A line for food. People in their cars because of the social distancing.
Right.
But a line that went a mile long.
A mile long. Oh. Something that we don't see yet here. Okay, go ahead.
In addition, you have, think about the fact that the United States is the only highly developed country that has a significant amount of hunger of this type. In New Jersey, there's been a major situation with the nursing homes, which many people will know about because it's become international news, that there was a nursing home which was found to have 17 dead bodies gathered in a room.
Wow.
And not in any kind of a morgue, not being appropriately attended to, because this nursing home was just so completely overwhelmed. And they've had over 40 people die of the virus, as well as including 2 employees.
Wow.
Now, the basic scenario that we're dealing with, the bigger situation, naturally, is that, in fact, the degradation of the healthcare system in New Jersey, in New York, and all across the United States has been caused by the obedience to this Wall Street, City of London system of economy, which is what Lyndon LaRouche spent his entire life fighting against, and which today we have to overcome.
Yeah.
That, essentially, even in the case of this nursing home situation, what you have is a kind of a policy of converting these facilities into completely for-profit institutions in which costs have been cut and all types of errors have been made in the name of increasing shareholder value.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the individuals are treated as though they were nothing more than something on an accounting sheet. And naturally, that is the case. That's the effect upon the world's population of the domination of this British Empire of London and Wall Street finance that we are still struggling under. Mm-hmm. So, essentially, what I'm fighting in my campaign to bring about a recognition of these conditions in the world and demand the only policies that will function. And those are the policies that were delineated by Lyndon LaRouche in 2014 in his document, 4 Economic Laws to Rescue the United States Economy, not an option, an immediate necessity, in which he lays out the essential principles by which we could revive the U.S. economy and free it from the grip of this financial oligarchy. Now, these principles are absolutely applicable to every nation in the world. And recently, Mr. LaRouche's widow, Helga LaRouche, who is an incredible world fighter, of course, who has been leading the Schiller Institute, leading an international fight now to bring these 4 laws into international practice. But essentially what we need to do is to stop this continued bailout of at least $5 trillion, possibly $10 trillion has been set aside as bailouts by the Federal Reserve, money printing. Mm-hmm. And in fact, they call it unlimited quantitative easing, unlimited QE, and it's been going back. I mean, these emergency measures have been going back all the way to September of last year. Mm-hmm. So it's been ongoing long before the pandemic emerged. And what we need is Glass-Steagall. We need to implement legislation in the United States and in every country in which we say no government is going to honor the debts of speculators above the debts of the actual physical economy.
Yes, let me stop. Let me interject. Just wanted to make sure that our listeners understand. Your first law, said by Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, is that there has to be a stop in this method of quantitative easing or unlimited quantitative easing, which in layman's terms, it means unlimited printing of money. And this is supposed to be being done by the, is it Federal Reserve?
Yes, that's exactly right.
And then this is being done by the Federal Reserve, unlimited printing of money, which is now lent at very 1 or 0 interest to the banks who are using this to pump in more liquidity or more money into the casino, which is the Wall Street. And in the process, by doing this, they've been doing this at a level of like something like $78 billion a day, isn't it, Daniel?
Absolutely.
Okay, in doing so, by just printing money and throwing it into Wall Street casino operations, this is creating such a level of hyperinflation. Inflation, which means the value of the dollar has probably disintegrated, and yet the real problem is the reason why we in the Philippines and the rest of the world are concerned. Our currencies are inextricably linked to the US dollar. And that's why I wanted our listeners to understand this particular #1 law that Lyndon LaRouche had presented, because if the value of the US dollar is being lost by this unlimited printing, there must be some impact eventually which we will feel with our currencies, which are inextricably linked to the US dollar. Is that correct, Daniel?
Yes, definitely. And very simple notion that there's an assumption by certain people that the U.S. dollar can be played in this way, in a sort of without end. That there's no limit to do this because the world depends upon the dollar as the world reserve currency. But that is a completely unscientific and nonsensical idea, because all you have to do is go to the foundations of physical economy and recognize that we actually are not increasing productivity. We're not increasing real production by means of this money printing.
Yeah.
This money printing is going only to support assets, financial derivatives, that are in fact completely divorced from physical reality. There's no one who's ever been able to, there's no food has never been hard because of because of one of these junk bonds. That's not the way the world works. The people who are benefiting from this are the tiny elite who are running the world's financial, markets, and they are rigging the system to their benefit. The question is, how much longer will people accept the lies that are being told to them? And I'll say further that Glass-Steagall is a policy that Roosevelt in 1933 implemented this policy. He was ensuring that the Wall Street swindlers were not able to continue to gamble with the assets of the population.
Okay, since you mentioned the Glass-Steagall, Daniel, the Glass-Steagall is a law which was passed during the time of Franklin Roosevelt, and it was designed to stop this, as you said, kind of feeding the casino type of business. Can you elaborate more, Daniel, as to why this Glass-Steagall law is going to stop it?
The way that it works is that we have a firewall that we establish between investment banking, as it's called, and commercial banking. Investment banking is a nice term for gambling, and ever since, well, essentially, in 1933, when this law was put into place, we said that it's never going to be the case that we're going to mingle the assets that deal with speculative activity with the assets that deal with mortgages, small business loans, infrastructure loans, virtual debt, things that are tied to the real economy. Because there are banking debts that have, that represent reality.
Right.
And that these are fictional. And so we said we're going to divide them up completely so that when the investment banking policy, when the investment activities fail, when you have a bubble pop, it will not, cause a contagion in the commercial debt. In other words, we won't allow there to be any mixture of these activities because mentally they're not the same.
Right.
People claim, oh, they're both banking. No, they're not. One of them is gambling, and one of them is nation building. And then in 1990, this law was repealed after decades of efforts in that direction by the Wolf and City of Operative. And so what happened was that Clinton was president, and the whole Congress had been massively massaged with money from Wall Street, and there were all types of claims that were made that we really need to remove this law so that we can be competitive with the European banks and otherwise. All kinds of sophistical lies were told. It was brought down, and within 10 years we had the 2008, 2009, 2007, 2008 financial crash.
Right.
Right, because we were allowing the growth of an outrageous bubble that was backstopped by the U.S. government, a policy of bailing out worthless assets, which only existed because of the removal of Glass-Steagall.
In other words, let me further, just for our listeners. In 1999, when this Glass-Steagall Act was repealed, first of all, the Glass-Steagall Act was to separate the monies that are in the banks that are supposed to support the physical economy, such as businesses and infrastructure and so on and so forth, versus what is supposed to be for investment banking, which is for Wall Street and casino type of investments. Now, this Glass-Steagall Act, which separated this, was repealed in 1999, and in effect combined all of the resources of banks to be used for speculation. And in effect, if they were used for speculation, even the depositor's money was no longer protected by the law of Glass-Steagall. The depositor's money was now open for banking executives and owners to be used and played in the casino, which is Wall Street. And was the biggest crash ever of the financial system. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, what happened when this happened in 2008? How did was it recovered, if it ever recovered?
There was uh, initiation of these policies that we referenced earlier. Despite of means by which to defeat financial crash and initiate a world renaissance, or scientific nuclear power, a world ice rail, right, Mr. LaRouche, putting forward the clear plan for a unitary system. Instead, what happened was that certain tricks were pulled out, which were things like $30 trillion in, essentially, $30 trillion in bailouts were, whipped up. And then, in addition to that, we began a 10-year process of this quantitative easing, money printing for the speculators' pockets. And that persisted not just in the United States, but with coordination at the European Central Bank and at the Bank of Japan. And in the meantime, the countries that have really not recovered from that.
You're coming in and out. We're losing about 50% of what you're saying, Daniel. Would you want me to call you up again so that we can have a better signal?
Yes, why don't you call me on Skype, please? That's probably the best way.
Skype, okay. Okay, well, while we're calling him, I just wanted to further explain. Yung pong nangyari sa Amerika noong 2008 nung nagkaroon ng crash. Tinanong ko po, so anong ginawa po ng Amerika kung bakit at paano nilang naibalik itong ang sabi niya hindi talaga naibalik. Ang ginawa lang ng Amerikano, the United States, is to print some more money. To print some more money and just kept on printing and printing it. It went into this massive printing of money, in which they call quantitative easing. And by quantitative easing, tatandaan niyo po this term of too big to fail started to come out at this time, because the ones who lost money were big investment banks, and they lost in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And in order to bail them out, the Federal Reserve had to print out a lot of money, relent to these bankrupt banks to play and revive the Wall Street activities again. You see, this additional printing, as Daniel Burke was saying, was not going into the productive side of the economy, but was just trying to bail out these banking institutions that have been enriching themselves through speculation. Okay. Now, this is the situation that U.S. was in. And I don't know if you heard it. He referred also to Europe and to Japan, because, like I said, anything that is happening in the markets of the United States will necessarily affect the activities in Europe, because they had almost practically common playgrounds, as you might say, because Europe was also involved in this printing of the euro game. So when this happened to the United States Wall Street, a similar thing happened to the stock market have you back, Daniel?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear
Okay.
me?
Okay, you're coming in loud and clear now.
Very good.
Yes.
Well, I can say that this is merely the first step, is to revive this policy in the United States and globally. And what you're going to do in that situation is create the basis for a sound currency. You're no longer going to have these enormous derivatives liabilities on our backs. Because what we're talking about, we're really talking about something in the neighborhood of $1.5 to $2 quadrillion of speculative assets in the world markets and in the world financial institutions.
Did you say 2 quadrillion? 2 quadrillion.
That's right.
Is like 1 quadrillion is 1,000 billion, right? So
It's 1,000 trillion.
what 1,000
Right.
trillion. One quadrillion is 1,000 trillion.
That's right.
1,000 trillion. Wow.
It's unbelievable.
Wow,
It's ridiculous.
Mind-boggling. 1,000 trillion. Wow. So that's 2,000 trillion you're talking about.
Yeah, you might as well just make up a number because it's just ungodly large, and and it seems absolutely insane and impossible because it is.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that the population of the world is responsible. Imagine the people who are laboring in the world and say that they are responsible for those debts. For somehow paying off those debts. It's just totally, absolutely absurd. And it demonstrates that the debts themselves are illegitimate. It's not, that's the critical issue. Glass-Steagall would allow us, if we implemented in the whole world, in every country, this principle, then we would be able to get the monkey off our backs.
Daniel, if the total debt that they created by just printing up is two quadrillion dollars, did you say?
Yes.
If it's $2 quadrillion, which is 2,000 trillion, what is total GDP of the world that can be matched with the debt? Because normally we match the debt with the actual production of the world.
Right. I don't know off the top of my head, but I think that the world GDP is somewhere in the tens of trillions. So it's minuscule compared to these speculative claims.
I have here something like the total GDP of the world is $49 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's 49 trillion against a debt of 2,000 trillion. Then the world is bankrupt.
Well, it comes from monetarism.
Yeah.
If you really want to look at it, it comes from the very concept that money itself is inherently valuable.
Yeah.
Which is an essential lie that people are, or sort of a cult that people are inculcated into by, in order to maintain this system. And it's just not going to fly anymore. It's not flying. It's not working at all. It never was. But now the populations of the United States and Europe in particular are feeling the effects of this lie as they watch the pandemic ravage their depleted healthcare system and see, 50 million people out of work in the United States.
Right.
You have, this is the only way that it's possible to convince people that these derivatives obligations are legitimate, these speculative obligations are legitimate, is if you have bewitched them into thinking that
money and value is a matter of what Wall Street and the City of London declare to be value. And that is, all you need is a person who has a sense of the real production, the creation of new real value in production. Anyone who's farmed, anyone who's worked in a manufacturing plant, anyone who's built a bridge knows that this is false.
Yeah.
And all it takes is to return and reassert that principle to change the dynamic. That's the essential underlying assumptions that we have to change in order to revive Glass-Steagall.
Okay. We're still there. What happens? What is the right step to take, as Lyndon LaRouche had enunciated at the time? No? What's the next step in order to correct this situation?
So there was a great genius in U.S. history whose name is Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary of the United States. Existed before. The principle of national bank up until the time period of Alexander Hamilton in the late 1700s, there was only the practice of essentially the same type of central banking that we're talking about from the Federal Reserve. Some differences, but essentially the same thing, where you had private banking cells, which is what the Federal Reserve. It's not a U.S. government operation in really.
Mm-hmm.
Private banking cartel, to enslave national governments. That was the whole purpose of those private banking cartels that were running the world through the means of the British East India Company and other things like the Dutch East Indies Company in that time period.
Mm-hmm.
And what Hamilton developed was he said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to initiate a financial system in our country in which the purpose of the bank is a bank that is owned by the U.S. government is to extend credit to the industrial and otherwise productive capabilities of the country. And so this is really what we need. It's a principle of directed credit, where we say the U.S. government, or indeed any national government, has every sovereign right to issue currency, to issue credit, but that credit is organized on behalf of that national government for the betterment of the population, and that is the essential step that needs to be taken, with the crucial distinction being that we're not going to be beholden to a cartel of Wall Street and City of London banks to sort of dictate these policies. So that presently the Federal Reserve issues currency, it issues credit, but only for speculative purposes. And what we're talking about in terms of a national bank is a bank that issues credit specifically for the purposes of the national government to increase the productivity of its economy as a whole, on a whole. And this principle was used repeatedly in the United States and in other countries as well. If you look at the situation with the transcontinental rail system, Abraham Lincoln was faced with a private banking system that was not adequate to his needs, and in fact the international lenders were all organized by the British Empire to support the Confederacy, and so he had the only option to take was to go to Hamilton's principles, and he initiated the greenbacks policy, whereby the Federal Treasury emitted greenbacks, in other words, currency, that was specifically directed to do projects like building the transcontinental rail system. And that's what we need to revive today. Franklin Roosevelt also implemented this policy of national banking through an institution called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which emitted, basically over $1 trillion in today's terms towards infrastructure projects.
It sounds very reasonable and logical, Daniel. But can a country unilaterally create this system, being a sovereign nation, and create a credit system without getting the rest of the world, without, if the rest of the world doesn't do that, can one country do it?
I think it's something that has to be done in conjunction. It's it is necessary for it to happen in the same experience of creating a new Bretton Woods agreement, a new monetary system agreement between the nations of the world. Right. In other words, the credit that needs to be applied to develop the underdeveloped regions of the world, to bring nuclear power online in every country, to build roads and canals and highway and high-speed trains. This credit is going to need to be organized from the top, international approach, but it's going to need national banks as a means of communicating that credit, so to speak.
Right.
We can't rebuild the world's economy with public-private partnerships in which Goldman Sachs gets a 10% cut. Right. That's not going to work. So you have to have vehicles of this quality in order to accept credit of this type and to also introduce and emit new credit from a national government, from a national credit vehicle.
In other words, whatever, let's say, one country unilaterally does in terms of issuing its own credit, and it will necessarily have to relate to other countries that have the capacity to help that country develop. And that relation will have to be some sort of a relationship in terms of the currency that the other country is issuing, or the value. They have valued their currency. And this leads to something like what the Bretton Woods Agreement had done, wasn't it, Daniel?
I missed the last words that you said. It's just something.
This leads to the relationship that is needed between countries who that will necessarily trade, or that can help us in development of nuclear power, for example. The relationship in currencies has to be established, and that is what led to Franklin Roosevelt's development of the Bretton Woods Agreement, wasn't it?
Absolutely. So you start from an intention to develop the world. You start from an assumption that absolutely no person in the world deserves to be unemployed. They don't deserve to be without health care, as the present situation makes very clear. No person in the world deserves to live in a condition of want. In fact, it is the sovereign right of every nation to be free and to be able to develop the potentials of their citizenry to the maximum. Mm-hmm. So if you begin from that standpoint, then you go into the idea of international monetary agreements with the concept that you have to facilitate the ability for nations to have basically to extend credit for those purposes.
Right.
And right now, the people who are dominating, the institutions that have dominated this extension of credit for many years have been the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other institutions like that. And these institutions, although they put on a nice face, or maybe they don't. I mean, Christine Lagarde is not a nice face, if you ask me. But okay. Their whole practice has been to saddle governments with unpayable debts, so that they spend most of their time paying off debt service. And in the meanwhile, the credit that was extended to them doesn't actually go to infrastructure. Much of it is sucked out of these countries by means of the offshore banking system immediately, and conditionalities are imposed. Yeah. Like, there was the case just a couple of years ago in Haiti where the government was overthrown after riots were initiated because of fuel subsidies being decreased. In other words, because the IMF put a conditionality on Haiti and said, you have to increase the price of gas and fuel for your population, otherwise we're not going to give you this money. And naturally, in a country like Haiti, if you increase the price of fuel by even a little bit, then you have completely destabilized the place.
Right.
And look, it's important to bring in the reality here, which is that the Chinese offered $4.2 billion to Haiti, and a very prominent firm from China was prepared to modernize Port-au-Prince. Mm-hmm. But the IMF, I believe, stepped in and said, no, you can't take on new debt until you pay off our debt.
That's right.
But what means were established to pay off that debt? None, other than austerity. Loot your population and kill them so that you can pay off our debt. It's like Shylock in the Merchant of Venice.
Merchant of Venice, yes, that's right. Now, so the other way, if I may add that, Daniel, that they kind of prevented the debtor countries from being able to pay their debt is the continuous and periodical devaluation of their currency versus the U.S. dollar. In our case here in the Philippines, in 1971, we have a currency exchange of 4 pesos to $1, which meant that our debt, in order to pay our $1 debt, we had to raise only 4 pesos. It had reached all the way up to 60 or even more, 60 pesos within 2-3 decades. No? And every time they do that, of course, our ability to service the debt becomes affected, and therefore we've had to privatize many of the corporations. We've had to open up our economies, and our companies were not protected. We have to deregulate our industries and oil and energy and so on and so forth, and other things. Because of that devaluation, I wanted to bring that out because sometimes some countries forget that this is the method of making it really difficult for you to repay debt. They just impose a statement saying, we think you are overvalued, so you have to devalue, or else you don't get to import oil, or something like that.
It's totally satanic. I mean, it's absolutely satanic and evil that is done. And it is exactly the thing that was outlawed under the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. Yeah. When the Allied powers came together, and Harry Dexter White was a representative of the United States, he was a representative of Franklin Roosevelt, and they fought for a policy that became fixed exchange rates, where we say, well, the exchange rates between countries, currencies, have to be reliable. They have to be predictable over a period of years to make credit of this type, because you loan money and then the currency has been devalued, your debt increases by 5 times or more than that, and 10 times, 20 times,
and then they say, well, this is just how the world works.
Right.
Well, what a stupid way for the world to work. You know, Helga LaRouche made a good polemic recently. She just said, systems are man-made.
Yeah.
If the system works this way, but it doesn't actually cohere with the reality, doesn't cohere with the real nature of the universe, then humanity can change that system. And it's very clear that we need to return to this fixed exchange rate system so that there could be parity agreements, whereby we simply say, all right, over the next period of some years, the exchange rate is not going to fluctuate between, more than within this narrow band. And that is going to allow us to identify, opportunities that otherwise there's no possibility of people saying, oh, well, it's a good incentive. There's no structure by which the investment in the people of the world is appropriate thing to do within this financial system. This financial system encourages mass speculation. That's the thing that is encouraged by it, and not production for the people.
Now, it's getting clearer, I'm sure even to our listeners now, that certain things have to be changed, and the nature of such things that need to be changed will need to be a collective effort on the part of countries. This is where the United States, China, India, and Russia will have to take the lead in terms of changing the financial and economic order. There are two other things that need to be discussed on the loss of LaRouche, but let me digress a bit. These four countries that I mentioned, what is your own personal expectation? Is it going to happen?
I'm happy to share with your listeners that there has been major progress made in the direction of a series of summits between these four powers, which were selected identified by Lyndon LaRouche about 20 years ago as being the essential powers to participate in the restructuring of the world economy, for the fact that they are the strategic, most significant nations in this sense, and that any agreement, in other words, the point being that any agreement is going to have to include an agreement amongst those four. It is not to say that those four are the people who run the world. That's opposite of what we're saying.
Right.
What we're saying is that if you have nations, if you want nations to be in charge of their own populations, and not the present situation where you have a financial oligarchy and the British and neocon intelligence services, the British and Anglophile intelligence services in the United States running the world, then we have to get these nations together, and that's going to establish a process whereby all nations can work together and can see the best for their own people. So I'm very happy to report to people that there is a major progress in this direction, and this is being organized by, in particular, Helga LaRouche and the International LaRouche Movement, and of course your work, Butch, is contributing to this in a very significant way, and your whole movement there. But the essential thing is that in April 25th and 26th, there was a conference that was held by the Schiller Institute, in which on the first panel were Helga LaRouche with Dmitry Polyansky, who is the first deputy representative of Russia to the United Nations, and Huang Ping, Ambassador Huang Ping, who is the Consul General of China to New York. And those two high-ranking officials, I mean, these are perhaps, there are perhaps two or three diplomats above them in the United States from those respective countries. So this is a very significant representation not of individuals, but of governments, in participating with the LaRouche movement in discussing these ideas with deep respect for what we represent and an increasing level of engagement. And they were briefed in full. They were brought into a thorough discussion, which includes many other conversations that didn't happen in public, about how to make this come true. But I want to make clear, that the situation in the United States is very challenging, because we did not have a high-ranking American official joining that same panel. And people, I think, may recognize that you have a Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who is going completely nuts.
Right.
And really a disastrous, I think would be appropriately termed, fascist policy of trying to organize the United States in a war against China with certain British intelligence officials and British representatives leading that charge. But I have a good news, which was reported in our Executive Intelligence Review Daily Alert, which was that there was an effort by President Trump to celebrate the meeting on the Elbe 75 years ago, when U.S. troops met with Soviet troops on the Elbe River towards the end of World War II, and agreed in what's called the Torgau Oath that they should never ever allow another war like that to happen. That President Trump and President Putin issued a joint statement in support of that. And since then, there's been another phone call between Trump and Putin. And according to Trump's ambassador to Russia, whose name is John Sullivan, there is a positive response emerging from President Trump and his team to the proposal of President Putin for a P5 summit. In other words, a summit to be held with the members of the UN Security Council, which include U.S., Russia, China, also France and the UK, which in our view is they should not be at the table for this kind of discussion. So it's not exactly the thing that we need, and indeed India is not included there. But this is a clear initiative by President Putin to make this kind of summit take place. As to the content of that summit, that continues to be the issue at hand for all of us, for your listeners, and for my own Senate campaign, and for the international political movement that we're building. That we have to introduce these kinds of insights into how to change the fundamental organizing principles of the world system. We have to make that introduction, because it's clear that we're moving in the direction of this, and we are in high-level dialogue with governments that are representative of this from Russia and China.
Okay, there are still two other items that we have not discussed on the loss of Lyndon LaRouche. One is the need for fusion energy, and the other is, forgot already, the energy flux density. Right? The public credit system has been somewhat discussed already. The energy flux density and the fusion economy. Now, but before we get into that, we still have time. I hope you have time to not eat your breakfast yet. We have some questions coming from some listeners, and Itos will read them out.
Very good. So I should comment on the fusion economy first.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. Well, I mean, the continued discussion of these four principles from LaRouche includes the idea that you have to, if you want to actually create new value in the world, it's not something so simple as saying, well, let's build some things and let's, and let's, repair some bridges and we'll make things look a little bit better. No, it's not like that. What we're talking about is the willful evolution of the human species. And that's the real issue in human economy. That what we're trying to do is to bring mankind to a higher control over the universe, a higher level of control of certain powers over the universe. And the name of the power that's most important is thermonuclear fusion energy. Because essentially what we're talking about in fusion, and this is something that requires some development, which maybe we can, another time, I'm sure you've had this conversation before, but what we're talking about is to go to harnessing the power within the sun. We're harnessing the power within the sun. We're not doing this bogus passive acceptance of the sun's rays in the form of solar panels. That is a total nonsensical idea. We're going up the ladder. We're going to control the sun. We're going to be like Prometheus, and we're going to get that light from the torch, and we're going to use that for humanity. And that is something that's going on in laboratories all across the world at a very, very high level, and it needs to be massively supported. It is so far not being supported in the way that it needs to be. But the implications of this kind of control over a new and more powerful capability, it's much, much more powerful, more intense energy from thermonuclear fusion, which is the combining, the fusing together of atoms, as opposed to fission, which is what happens in a nuclear fission plant where you break apart atoms.
Right.
We're combining small atoms. It releases a gigantic amount of energy because of what Einstein learned and discovered about the equivalency of energy and mass, the famous E equals mc squared. We find that there's an enormous amount of energy locked into the nucleic bonds within the atoms, and when we fuse these atoms together, we have the ability to create a level of energy that would mean electricity would be too cheap to measure. Now, this is something that we can apply for the benefit of all mankind in not only applications in our own, earthbound economy, but also in terms of man's exploration of the solar system and out into the galaxy. And if you want a sense of what we're really ultimately talking about when we're discussing this transformation of the world economy, we're talking about humanity growing up out of this period where we're chained to the earth, and we're going to be going out there as a human species. Many nations, many peoples, many language cultures represented, all in their unique way, but working together for the common purposes of humanity in industrializing the moon, in colonizing Mars, in developing asteroid defense systems. So there's far more things to discuss on this respect. I'm just even barely referring to what's going on. But Mr. LaRouche made absolutely clear, he pointed the way, that if we want to make a breakthrough for humanity, if we want to make it sustainable, that we defeat the British Empire, then we have to do that with breakthroughs in thermonuclear fusion energy.
Yeah, I just wanted you to add the comparison between fission energy and fusion energy in terms of the level of power, the amount of power that it can generate, because fission energy right now is, it's still a dream, and as far as the Philippines is concerned. And we have a nuclear power plant that for some stupid reasons, the previous administrations and the present have not yet turned it on. But we're still in the fission energy. But I understand fusion energy has to do with something like 100 times more efficient than the fission energy. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct.
And that
That's exactly correct.
And that the heat that it can generate is something like 10 times the heat of the core of the sun. Is that true?
Yes, in fact, in laboratories in Princeton, New Jersey, we already have temperatures that are higher than what's going on in the sun. We already have accomplished that.
No wonder you were saying that it will be producing electricity too cheap to be even to measure. What a great future for mankind if we're able to move towards that direction. Yeah.
I mean, I constantly am putting this to people to try to get the breakthrough and get an idea of what we mean in terms of a breakthrough. I have a daughter who's 2 years old.
Yeah.
When my young life was shaped by 9/11. I was in junior high when the 9/11 attacks took place in the United States, and you had, after that, war, chaos, destruction, just disaster. The Iraq War, million Iraqis killed, and just a tremendous manipulation of the population, the Patriot Act, all types of disastrous developments in the world and in the United States, characterized by war. If we have a devotion to fusion power today, then perhaps when my daughter is graduating high school, we will be implementing it. We will have commercial fusion power plants in the world, and we'll be using that for the benefit of all.
Yeah.
So this is not some distant dream. This is a matter of 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, and I can see that, and I can see. Well, just the thought of it makes me want to live 50 years longer. Able to see it.
50 years.
Yeah.
Do it. That's what we want.
Okay, well, but let's look at the next step.
Yes.
Aside from, as you said, fusion energy, in other words, us economists must look into the fusion energy as something that is going to, be the basic infrastructure that will be needed for the kind of economies that we will be developing in the future. Right? Now, like I said, here in the Philippines, we're still not even outside oil and coal, and we still have to realize the benefits of fission energy. And as you're calling for fusion, I don't think we can make that jump, but I'm sure the rest of the world maybe can. China and France and some other countries might be going into it, including the United States. But us, we're just hoping that I will still be alive if we're able to start our fission energy, but that nuclear power plant. But let's go now.
Yes,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm familiar with the fight that you've waged on the Bataan nuclear plant, and I think it's extremely important that your listeners join you in that and make that happen.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep on fighting. But it's you guys that are inspiring us to keep on fighting, Daniel. The fact that you're even running for the Senate is also inspiring for many of our listeners, I'm sure. Now, let's go to the fourth law. The fourth law is the energy flux density. What does that mean?
So, as we try to think through, okay, if economy is not a matter of money, if we say that the British imperial concept of money as being inherently valuable, if we say that's a fraud, and we say, no, in fact, value is something that derives from the human creative ability, the unique ability in all human beings the ability to make discoveries of universal principle, to understand the laws of our universe through a power of hypothesis, if that's really where new value comes from, in other words, scientific, technological breakthroughs and cultural breakthroughs that allow us to communicate these things and implement these new discoveries, then we must look at, well, what is the nature of that improvement that is made through science and technology?
Right.
And what you're really looking at is not merely like, people like to talk about NASA and about the achievements from the space program and say, well, there's Velcro, and it was created, and Tang, and sort of silly things like this. But that's not really the character of technological progress, according to Mr. LaRouche, and I think it's very clear if you begin to think about it. He indicated this concept of energy flux density. And his point was that there's a difference between using a butter knife and using a scalpel, even if you apply the same amount of pressure. You use the butter knife and you're going to cut the butter, but if you use the scalpel, you can, the surgeon can cut into a person's skin and successfully operate on them. And this is because the scalpel has a smaller area, surface area, where the pressure is applied. So in other words, you apply the same amount of pressure, same amount of force, but to a smaller surface area. Yeah. And therefore you increase the density of energy that you're putting into that, the density of the energy that you're putting in. Same amount of force, but a smaller area. Now, that's the basic principle of economics, is that we want to make it so that one man can do the work of 100. By utilizing this kind of technology can increase the overall power of a single individual. And what's most essential in being able to do that in human economy is to control what's happening at the very center of production. When you are producing things in your economy, when you're producing steel and concrete, when you're producing machine tools, you're producing automobiles or locomotives or whatever it may be, building materials, you need to be able to have the greatest possible energy flux density that you're wielding at that point, so that for every amount of work you do, you get the maximum amount of output. And the best way to do that is to actually look at how you're producing your energy. If you're producing your energy merely by burning wood, then you are not acting in a way that is that is going, well, anyway, that's a lower density of energy than if you go up to coal. And if you go from coal to petroleum, and if you go from petroleum to fission, each of these include a increase of the intensity of the energy, or in other words, the energy flux density. You think about it, this allows not merely an increase of the amount of work that you can do, but it's an increase in the quality of work that you can do. Right. Because
okay, we're back on air now, and
very good.
And as you were saying, you want to finish up this matter on the energy flux density, because we were cut off a few minutes before we realized it.
Well, I'll just say this very briefly. Once you begin to investigate the idea of energy flux density, then you will realize that the real evil of the Malthusian green policy, the people who want to reduce the world's population, central bankers of London and otherwise, like Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, who say that the world needs
solar panels and wind power. Or, for example, Mike Bloomberg, who's trying to eliminate all coal power plants across the world and impose green energy. This is a disastrous policy of lowering the energy flux density, and really in every country there should be a total fight to create increases in the energy flux density in your nation, which means increasing electricity consumption, it means increasing productive capability, and it means a fight for nuclear energy.
Yes. And as you said, you talked about the green is it green revolution, green movement of the environmentalists. Now, I know it's very strong in the United States and the rest of the world, but one of their how do you say, countries that they have so influenced to the point of stupidity is the Philippines. And we have had such a big influence that we developed a new department for it called Department of Environment or something like that. And it only added to the regulatory situation of government, and in a way was one of the things that prevents development in many areas, because the Department of Environment was given by law some sort of authority to inspect or intervene or to completely disallow operations, business operations that they considered as detrimental to the environment. Now, I don't know if you've seen countries that were able to negate this or contain this, but how does a country like ours look into this and convince governments that this is not good for us?
Well, I want to take this opportunity. We have another subject we want to go into, but I do want to take this opportunity to say that I really invite you and your listeners to join me in building an international youth movement.
Okay.
Because the fundamental, it is not going to be possible to change the situation in the Philippines regarding this atrocious environmental department you're describing, which sounds like a department of idiocy. But we can't. You're not going to change that. We are not going to change that without an overall change in system. In other words, what's really needed is a fight to eliminate poverty in every country, and to eliminate, to pull people out of the slums and to give them employment and to give them appropriate conditions of life, because it's completely intolerable that in any country people are living in slum conditions.
Right.
And if you want to change that, then I really think, as we discussed earlier, you need the whole world system to change. So what we're embarked upon, and I'm heavily involved with and very proud to be, is an international youth movement, which we just had a breakthrough conference on this yesterday by Zoom, online, international, in which we had at least 10 countries represented, and we about doubled the number of youth that we had on the previous time that we had one of these. This is our second time meeting in this way. We had about 80 youth on from all over the world, Yemen, Peru, Mexico, Colombia, Denmark, Germany, France, and many others. We had people from Pakistan, from Morocco. We had other people who were coming in, and from people from all over the United States, who were coming in to an idea that if the youth of the world want this future to come about, this better future, then they have to work together now, each from their respective nations, but in a cooperative way, to demand from the governments that they do what's necessary. And so in particular, this was a conversation that took place with Helga Zeppler-Rouge, as it was a Schiller Institute event, and we are, calling on our people from all over the world to use a new petition that's gone out on the Schiller Institute website for a world health system.
Right.
And the proposed call, which includes the ideas that we've already discussed, but proposal to build up a health system for every country to fight the pandemic and to prevent any future pandemics, as well as we'll be putting out from the Schiller Institute a food program to feed every person on the planet. What are the things that would be required to make that happen? And these are the things that the youth really should be working towards, the students, that the 15 to 25-year-olds should be fighting for this.
And this can be done through the Zoom because it can take on even 100 people together, right?
Yes, we had about 100. I think that very soon we'll have 500.
Wow.
And, I really see a potential for growth in this. It's moving quickly. And, yesterday we translated it, simultaneous translation into French, Spanish, and German. And then for the next time, we'd like to also have Arabic, because we have a number of very brave and inspiring young people in Yemen who would like to join us.
Wow. Okay.
And people who are listening to this, who are youth or who know youth and students who could join us, you can go to the Schiller Institute website, and we will have. Here's the point: we did one 6 weeks ago, then we did yesterday, and I talked to Helga and said, "Well, how often should we do these?" And she said, "We should do them every 2 weeks." And so that's what we're doing.
Okay,
so
that's good to know, because Ethos is listening very intently to what you're saying, and I'm sure he'd like to participate together with some other youth members here of the LaRouche organization. Yeah.
Fantastic.
All right. Great. Well, more power to this, and the future of the world actually is in the hands of this group that you are forming, Daniel, and congratulations. Now, I'd like to switch over back to the United States, specifically about President Trump and the kinds of difficult situations he's facing. COVID-19 and COVID-19, the U.S. seems to be showing the most affected country in as far as this COVID pandemic is concerned. You have the most cases and the most mortalities. What is the situation, Daniel?
Well, you can imagine it's a very challenging dynamic in the United States, because the preparedness was not there to do the things that were done successfully in Wuhan to shut down, and in Hubei province generally, to control the virus and to destroy, to defend the population. There's not a preparedness to do that in the United States, and therefore, things like contact tracing, we're doing a very, very small amount of that. Yeah. Or the ability to, it's been widely reported, and it's quite clear that most people get the virus in their homes from their family members and members of their household. But what they did in Wuhan was that they took people as soon as they were identified as being sick, and they moved them out of their homes, and thereby mitigated the tendency of people to transmit it to their family members. And that's not being, that's when you raise that idea to Americans who are being whipped up by by a bunch of excitement, including various types of conspiracy theories about all types of things, then, the response has been, no one can take me out of my home. No one's going to take me. No government is going to come into my house and take me away from my kids. And, this was, of course, the kind of thing that's being manipulated by various people who want to continue the attacks on Trump. I mean, there are many things that Trump could have done better, and there are many things. I mean, some of it is just a matter of the present conditions of the U.S. health system, which he's not responsible for causing those to happen. But he could have done things better. But what you're watching is that there's a sort of a controlled. Both sides are being controlled right now. Both sides of the debate. There's the people who have been whipped up in anger against Trump for totally fraudulent reasons like Russiagate are now saying it's all Trump's fault. Trump's a disaster, and therefore we should get rid of him for the failure to address the pandemic. And then on the other side, you have Trump's own supporters who are being whipped up by another angle on this, and they're going out and doing a bunch of protests of the lockdowns that are being done basically in order to make him look bad. And I know this from experience because I've been, if you go back to the Charlottesville rally, there was a rally in the United States of people who supposedly supported President Trump in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. I was invited to that rally, and then I didn't go because it turned out it was clear that it was an intelligence operation, and there were people there who were neo-Nazis, who were, who then a young woman tragically died, and it was blamed on President Trump and used as a slander on Trump that he was supporting white supremacy, which was completely fraudulent. Right. So both sides of this are being controlled and making it very, very difficult for appropriate measures to be taken. But I would say that we have to take a big shift in this country. If it's going to take, everything is not, over and done. The cases continue to rise outside of New York. New York has been contained, and there's been massive, measures taken in New York City to contain the virus. But in the rest of the country, the numbers are on the rise. We're going to see a lot more deaths, and it's something that's really, if we're going to stop that, it's going to take a very aggressive series of steps, including, for example, we could easily and rather cheaply hire on about 180,000 new people to do contact tracing, and in which, we would identify who you've been in touch with when you are tested positive, and communicate to those people, you've been in touch with someone who's been tested positive, and you need to go and, seclude yourself. You need to go into quarantine, there's a good trigger for this to happen. In fact, I think there's a very good likelihood that we can get that kind of measure, because it's international news that President Trump was in touch with a defense aide, had contact with a defense aide who turns out had coronavirus. Right. And in fact, the CDC and NIH leadership were just announced today that they're going to be working from home for 2 weeks because they were in touch with someone with the virus. So if we're going to do that for the leadership of the country, then shouldn't we be doing that for the average person to the best of our ability?
Right. Well, I'm not going to go into the like you said, conspiracy theories and calling it a hoax and so on and so forth. But the problem is, as you said, this has to be addressed, whether or not those things have any basis. But this has to be addressed because people are actually dying, and what you had mentioned about the was it a home for the aged that had 17 bodies just laying there without any because they couldn't do anything anymore. I mean, this thing has to
Just to interject here, that there's a story in the New York Times this morning that 1/3 of all of the deaths in the United States from COVID-19 are in nursing homes.
Wow.
And so if that's true, then it sort of demonstrates the fact that this could be could have been properly addressed.
That's right.
You know, you can imagine that there are steps that could have been taken at nursing homes all over the country
We're
to
talking
prevent that from happening.
30% of about 75,000 now, that died in nursing homes. Wow, that's a pretty big sector. Yeah.
It's enormous because, and the point is that the coronavirus travels very quickly.
Yeah.
And in contained environments like that. But the other point is that these nursing homes are poor quality.
Right.
You know,
Like
they didn't even have. They were already substandard.
Yeah.
And then you introduce a crisis like this, and there was no possibility of dealing with it. And so you had, of course, this began in Seattle. There was major deaths.
Yeah.
But the idea that you would have like one facility which could have at maximum several hundred people and 50 people die.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole thing people are talking about is how we should defend the vulnerable.
Right.
Well, we haven't done that, so why not? What is it what was lacking that we allowed that to happen?
Right.
And what do we need to do to change it? But
Okay.
please go ahead.
One question before we leave this subject, Daniel. Do you believe Fauci is credible?
I don't know. I don't know. I think that I don't know. I don't have enough of a reading to be able to answer that. But I do think what I think is for certain, from my studies of the matter and following the whole process since January, is that what I can say for sure is that the steps that were taken in Wuhan by the Chinese government worked.
Yeah.
And I looked, the people who claim that it didn't work and that the Chinese deaths are higher than they claim are completely unbelievable. They're not credible at all.
Right.
It's like Mike Pompeo, as though I'm going to believe something that Mike Pompeo says about China.
Right.
And so I think that if you follow the report from the WHO right after they went to China, and they had American experts with them and so forth, I read that report, and what I see is that there were clear steps that were taken. Now it's a different thing once you get into the United States. Once it emerges from there, it was a different animal that we had to address in its own unique way as it came in. But I can say that I think that those steps were clearly successful.
Yeah. Okay. We agree on it too. Okay. There are questions that have been coming in from our viewers. Itos will be reading it up, and maybe you could react to them, Daniel.
Please.
Right. Okay, Daniel. I guess this question is for both of you. Joselaro Malonzo wants to ask, how will a new system be implemented? Will you be writing off all the bad debt of the developing sector nations, and so that this doesn't benefit only the developed nations? How is the process there with regards to their debt?
Daniel?
So, very recently, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, who is a Nobel Prize winner because of the successful peace operations that took place there, he has made a very prominent call for the cancellation of the debt of African nations and of third world, of developing nations generally. And this is a crucial step in what needs to be done. Now, the way to think about it, the very obvious thing to do is to go back to the 1953 London Debt Conference, which was the debt conference in which the United States
fought for the cancellation of more than half, I believe, of the German war debt. And if it were not for the cancellation of that debt, which was imposed because of a war that the German government was culpable for,
Yes.
then you wouldn't have had the German miracle. Now, none of these countries that are saddled with debt, none of the countries in the world that are saddled with debt, the developing countries, started any wars to incur that debt. So it's even ridiculous beyond that. But the fact of the matter is that if you do not cancel this debt and initiate the new credit for a world health system, as is stipulated in this new Schiller Institute petition, then it's not going to be possible to prevent that continuation of that pandemic to ravage these nations and to come back in a second wave. As people know, the Spanish flu came back in a more deadly second wave, and could certainly be the same case with the COVID-19. So absolutely, we need to eliminate the illegitimate debts, and really the whole purpose must be seen as the eradication of poverty in the world, the increasing of the ability of nations to promote their own population's general welfare.
Okay. Just a question. I think, Daniel, I just wanted to ask her. How will the U.S. pay its debt to China?
Do you mean will we cancel the debt, the $1
Yes.
trillion in bonds?
Will it be canceled, or will there be a restructuring, or?
I think that's the British Empire's, wet dream, is that we have such a disastrous decoupling of, that would basically be a complete destruction of the world monetary system. Because, you have to imagine that if you're holding, if you're the Japanese holding $1 trillion in U.S. treasuries,
Yes.
and you see the U.S. cancel $1 trillion of treasuries owned by China, then even though there's this entrenched, relationship, they're going to start selling the treasuries.
Right.
Why would they believe that? So I don't think that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
But if it did, but there are people who are advocating it because of the fact that it's a chaos factor. It would almost certainly be, lead to war. I can't imagine any other outcome.
Yeah, and somewhat, I think, since we mentioned that the four countries will get together, among the things that can be discussed is the arrangement that can be made in the terms of each other's debt, and that's something that can be very easily discussed. I just wanted to add on, since it's our...
Yeah, let me add that, what we're proposing, or one of the things that we have proposed in the past is Paul Gallagher, your friend Paul Gallagher from DIR, he has indicated that it's possible to take those treasuries owned by the Chinese and by the Japanese and actually convert them into the investments for a U.S. national infrastructure bank, and that you can organize such an approach so that it's amenable, it's appealing to the Chinese and the Japanese and other U.S. debt holders because they will receive a greater return.
That's right.
In such a process, and so it's going to be win-win.
All right.
So that's one obvious means by, or not obvious, but one available means by which we can address that problem.
Right. Yeah, and especially if the whole economic order is shifted to what we were talking about, then that will really be one of the most positive ways. What about countries like us? We've also doubled the idea of a debt moratorium, which of course our own economists in government already saying that that's not on the table because they're spokesmen of the IMF. But is it possible then that we get it restructured by talking to BRICS Bank or even the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in terms of assuming the debt and reconverting it to something more long-term so that we can sustain the debt service? Is that possible?
I would say that there's an important step that was taken recently, which again was reported in the EIR Daily Alert, which is the fact that the declared that it was not acceptable, not constitutional,
Right.
for the European Central Bank, in the name of the German government, to continue massive bailouts to the international banks. And this is the first step. There was a significant response from Italy, where some prominent people, including Matteo Salvini, the leader of Lega Nord, I believe, they indicated that this is an appropriate turn from the idea that governments serve money to, or that man serves money, to the idea that money serves man. And so this is merely the first step. It can go in many directions, but it is encouraging that there is a revival of a concept of national sovereignty in Germany, the most important economy in Europe. Now, their government leadership is absolutely terrible, but you have a potential that should be recognized, because I believe that there must be a creation of these new credit vehicles that the Philippines could receive credit from the institutions to which you referred. I think it's certainly possible, but we really need a much, much larger implementation of that kind of approach. What Paul Gallagher has stipulated is that we need about $125 trillion in new credit for the world to bring about the necessary improvements in physical economy.
Right.
And that means wholly new institutions, and Christine Lagarde should be, kicked out of the human race.
Okay. Wow, Daniel, time went so fast. We've run out of time. We had you quite a bit of, for an hour and a half, and still not enough. This will not be the first and the last time. I hope you'll make yourself available. But since we have just a couple of minutes to go, I'd like you to have the last say and your message to the Filipinos all over the world. By the way, we have listeners coming from the United States and right there in New Jersey as well. We have people sending messages to us from all parts of the United States, all parts of Europe, and Asia as well. So go ahead, Daniel.
Well, I want to thank you and Itos very much for inviting me to join you. It's been my pleasure. You are a big source of inspiration, and we watch what you do very carefully.
Thank you.
So I want to say to people that, excuse me, first of all, I am so glad that there are people in New Jersey who rapidly came into my campaign because of your work, Butch, really? Such as Mr. Hippolito.
Yes, Jim.
And it's wonderful to point to him because, and I hope he's listening, because
Jim, Jim, yeah.
Yeah, his son is an example of the youth process that we need. And we have people. So he's been working with our youth activity, and we need more of that.
I genuinely think that we're talking about such an enormous change in the world system. Most people do not have room in their heads to consider it.
Right.
And so what we need is an actual capability from the youth to drive the imagination and to demand a future for their own, for their own lives.
Right.
I mean, 50 years from now, imagine what could be accomplished by humanity.
That's right.
We could create the dynamic in which every country has the creation of an economy that allows their people to live out a purposeful, meaningful life, and that no life is left to squandered, living in conditions where a person can barely think because they're spending all of their time simply trying to survive, and many of them don't. That is a crime against humanity, and it's an intolerable state of affairs in our world today. In 50 years, we could change that. In 50 years, someone who's 19 today, will be 69. I mean, it's not, and we're gonna change this. And it shouldn't take us 50 years to change it.
Right.
It's going to take us not that long to do that, but in 50 years we'll be able to look back and say, my goodness, look how far we've come, that now humanity is working together on the exploration of the solar system, that we have industrialized the moon, excuse me, that we're going out into the galaxy.
Yeah.
If we have fusion rockets, we'll be sending rockets out past the solar system into interstellar space, and it takes about 50 years for a fusion rocket to get from here to Alpha.
Yeah.
So there's a tremendous capability, to do this kind of thing, to look in that way at the world potential. And so I really want to say that my campaign was initiated from the beginning with an idea to reach youth in our country, in New Jersey, and across the world. And I invite all of your listeners to join us and to represent the Philippines and the unique cultural beauty, strength and beauty within the Philippine culture and within the Philippine nation, and bring that forward so that the world can come to understand that ever better. And I think that the best platform to do that is this international youth movement and the Schiller Institute generally. We have many opportunities for people to participate in that vehicle. So that's what I had to say. I think that.
Okay.
Sorry to go on, but support my Senate campaign in New Jersey. That's it.
Right.
At BurkeForSenate.com.
Okay, that's Daniel Burke, Schiller Institute, running for the Senate in the United States, coming from the state of New Jersey. So all of you Filipinos that have relatives and friends in New Jersey, please contact them right now and tell them about Mr. Daniel Burke. Thank you very much, Daniel, and hope to be able to get in touch again. Maraming salamat
Thank
po.
you very much. Bye.
Bye. Okay, yun po ang ating programa ngayon. Narinig natin, nakapanayam natin, walang iba kundi si Daniel Burke. He's in his, I think, middle 40s now, but you can see he's very well versed about the goings on and everything that is happening not just in the United States but in the rest of Europe. Yan po ang klaseng politiko, kung maging politiko siya, ang kakilanganin po ng maski anuman bansa. Pero sa Amerika po, siya po ang isa sa mga kinakailangan natin nandun. Kasi po, they have this, alam nyo yung attitude na ang kanilang effort is that the United States must work collectively and collaborate with the rest of the world for the sake of humanity. Hindi po sila yung mga naririnig natin mga ibang mga Amerikano o mga British o mga ibang Europeans na that see themselves as ascendant over any other race. No? Kanya po nagustuhan ko itong mga taong ito, and I got involved with them as early as 1984. No? At naging kaibigan ko po, nakilala ko po si Mr. Lyndon LaRouche mismo, si Helga and the rest. No? At diyan po tayo na-inspire na pumasok dito sa mga activities na ginagawa po natin ngayon. At sana po napakinggan nyo at magsama-sama tayo sa pagpapaunlad hindi lang po ng ating bayan, kundi ng buong mundo. No? Katulad po ng sinasabi ni Daniel Burke. So, sa ngalan po ng ating mga katipon dito sa ating katipunan at sa magagaling na staff ng DCXL Radio Mo Nationwide na nag-simulcast sa atin, kami po ay pansamantalang nagpapaalam at nagpapasalamat na sinamahan nyo kami ngayon ang Ora de Peligro ng ating bayan at ng buong mundo. Hanggang sa linggo po muli, ang ating katipunan ay same time, same channel, Katipunan Channel, 7 to 9 p.m. But every Tuesdays and Thursdays, kikita muli tayo dito sa Talakayan Bayan kasama po si Toti Casino at si RJ Havellana. Magandang gabi po at mabuhay ang Pilipinas.